In 1896, archaeologists dug into a room buried beneath one of America's greatest ancient ruins and found 9 bodies that shouldn't have been connected. No records, no names, just bones, sealed in silence for over 1,000 years. It would take more than a century, and a DNA lab most people have never heard of, to figure out who they really were. And when the answer finally came, it didn't just rewrite the history of Chaco Canyon. It reached forward through 800 years and landed on the doorstep of a living tribe who had been saying it all along. To understand why this discovery matters so much, you have to understand what Chaco Canyon actually was. Tucked into the high desert of northwestern New Mexico, Chaco doesn't look like much at first glance. It's dry, it's remote. The wind moves across empty stone floors where something enormous used to stand. But between the years 800 and 1130, this canyon was the beating heart of an entire world. The people who lived here, the Ancestral Puebloans, built massive structures out of sandstone and timber, some of them 4 and 5 stories tall, containing hundreds of rooms apiece. These weren't simple villages. They were engineered on a scale that wouldn't be matched in North America for centuries. Roads, straight as arrows, stretched for dozens of miles across the desert, connecting Chaco to distant communities. Massive kivas, circular ceremonial chambers, were built with a precision that still puzzles architects today. And somehow, in the middle of an unforgiving landscape with limited water and limited farmland, this civilization thrived for more than 300 years. And Chaco wasn't isolated. Archaeologists have identified dozens of outlying communities scattered across the wider Southwest, from what is now Colorado down into Arizona, all linked back to the canyon through trade, ritual, and those same arrow-straight roads. Turquoise arrived from hundreds of miles away. Macaw feathers and copper bells were traded up from what is now Mexico, evidence of contact networks stretching far beyond anything most people imagine when they picture the ancient Southwest. Timber for the great houses, tens of thousands of trees in total, was hauled in from mountain ranges more than 50 miles distant, without the benefit of wheels or draft animals. Whatever social and political system organized all of this, it was sophisticated enough to coordinate labor, resources, and ceremony across an enormous stretch of desert for centuries at a time. That's the scale of the civilization we're actually talking about. And it's exactly why the question of what happened to its people and who its descendants are today has mattered so much to archaeologists for well over 100 years. Then, sometime around the year 1200, it stopped. The people left. The great houses were abandoned. The roads fell silent. For centuries afterward, nobody could say with certainty where the people of Chaco actually went, or who, if anyone, could still call themselves their descendants. That question sat unanswered for so long that it became one of the great open mysteries of North American archaeology. Explorers speculated, anthropologists theorized, tribes across the Southwest maintained their own oral histories, insisting they knew exactly where they came from. But without hard evidence, those claims were often brushed aside by outsiders as folklore rather than fact. This is where the story of Room 33 begins. In the late 1800s, archaeologists exploring Pueblo Bonito, the largest and most elaborate of Chaco's great houses, broke into a small, unremarkable-looking chamber. Inside, they found something startling. Buried beneath the floor, layered over generations, were the remains of individuals interred with extraordinary care. Turquoise beads by the thousands, ornate jewelry, ceremonial objects. Whoever these people were, they had been treated with a level of reverence that set them apart from almost everyone else buried in the canyon. Most residents of Chaco, when they died, were placed outside their homes in simple midden mounds along with everyday debris. But the individuals in Room 33 had been placed inside the heart of the greatest building in the canyon, wrapped, adorned, and sealed away with wealth that suggested status of the highest order. The remains were removed from the site and shipped across the country to the American Museum of Natural History in New York City. And there they stayed, largely forgotten by the public, sitting in storage for more than 100 years. Nobody could say for certain who these 9 individuals were to each other. Were they unrelated elites, buried together simply because of the room's importance? Were they warriors, priests? Or was there something more specific tying them together, something that couldn't be seen just by looking at bones and beads? For a long time, there was no way to answer that question. Then ancient DNA technology caught up with the mystery. In the mid-2010s, a team of researchers, including specialists in ancient genomics, was finally given the chance to extract genetic material from the remains. This wasn't a simple process. DNA that old is fragile, degraded, and often contaminated. Pulling a clean, reliable genome from bone that has spent 9 centuries in the ground requires laboratories built specifically for the task, sealed environments designed to prevent modern DNA from ever touching the ancient samples. The team extracted what they could from 6 of the 9 individuals, the ones with the best preserved genetic material, and ran the results through modern sequencing technology. What came back stunned Eva and the scientists involved. All 9 individuals in room 33 shared an identical mitochondrial genome. For those unfamiliar with the science, mitochondrial DNA is passed down exclusively through the maternal line, from mother to child, generation after generation, essentially unchanged unless a mutation happens to occur. Sharing an identical mitochondrial genome across 9 separate burials wasn't a coincidence. It meant every single person in that room traced their maternal ancestry back to the same woman. But the researchers didn't stop there. Using the 6 best preserved samples, they were able to reconstruct actual family relationships using nuclear DNA, the genetic material inherited from both parents. What they found was almost unbelievable in its clarity. Among the individuals in that crypt were a mother and her daughter, a grandmother and her grandson. This wasn't a random collection of important people who happened to be buried together. This was a family. Specifically, this was evidence of an unbroken maternal line of descent, a lineage of women passing status, identity, and likely power down through their daughters and their daughters' children for an estimated span of roughly 330 years. 330 years. Think about what that means. That's longer than the United States has existed as a country. That's 10, maybe 12 generations of the same family being buried in the same sacred room, inside the largest, most important structure in the entire canyon, in a society that left behind no written language, no king lists, no inscriptions boasting of royal lineage. This genetic evidence was the closest thing archaeologists had ever found to actual proof of a ruling dynasty in the ancient Americas. Researchers began referring to it exactly that way. A matrilineal dynasty, a family of women whose bloodline defined who held power and prestige at Chaco Canyon for over 3 centuries. This upended a lot of assumptions about how ancestral Puebloan society actually worked. For decades, archaeologists had debated whether Chaco was organized around elite families at all, or whether its society was more egalitarian, more communal, without the kind of hereditary hierarchy seen in other ancient civilizations. The Room 33 findings suggested otherwise, at least for this particular family, in this particular room. Status here wasn't just earned, it was inherited, and it passed specifically through women. That detail alone forced a rethink of how gender and power may have operated in this society, since so much of the popular imagination around ancient hierarchies defaults to male rulers, male bloodlines, and male inheritance. Here, the evidence pointed in exactly the opposite direction, at least within this one elite family, at this one site, for this one extraordinary stretch of time. Of course, not everyone in the field agreed on how far to take this conclusion. Some anthropologists pushed back on the word dynasty itself, pointing out that a single elite family in a single room didn't necessarily prove that this family ruled over the entire canyon, let alone the wider Chaco world that stretched across the greater Southwest. Maybe this was one powerful lineage among several. Maybe their influence was limited to Pueblo Bonito itself, rather than extending across every great house and every community tied into the Chaco network. It's a fair critique, and one that shows how careful scientists have to be when reading enormous meaning into a small, extraordinary sample. But regardless of exactly how far their influence reached, the discovery confirmed something remarkable. Whoever these women were, their family mattered enough for over 300 years to be buried at the absolute center of Chacoan civilization, surrounded by riches, in a room that clearly held deep ceremonial and social significance. And this discovery, as fascinating as it was, still left the bigger question completely unanswered. If this family ruled, or at least held enormous status, for centuries, and then the entire civilization emptied out around the year 1200, what happened to them? Did the bloodline simply end? Did it disappear into the wider population, scattered and lost? Or did it survive quietly for another 800 years, waiting for someone to ask the right question? That question would eventually be answered, but not by outside archaeologists digging into new sites. It would be answered because a living tribe decided to take their own history into their own hands. Roughly 60 miles north of Santa Fe, tucked into the folds of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, sits Picuris Pueblo. Today it's a small community, but it wasn't always. Around the year 1600, Picuris was home to more than 3,000 people, one of the larger and more influential pueblos in the entire region. Then came a wave of devastation that swept across so much of indigenous North America. European contact arrived in the area in 1591, and with it came disease that the population had no immunity against, violence that accompanied colonization, and religious persecution that specifically targeted native spiritual practices and community structures. Over the following centuries, the population of Picuris was reduced dramatically. Entire lines of oral tradition, entire threads of communal memory were placed under enormous strain, some lost entirely, as elders died and colonial authorities actively worked to suppress indigenous language, religion, and history. And yet, through all of that, one story survived. Picura's elders maintained, generation after generation, that their people were descended from the population that once thrived at Chaco Canyon. This wasn't a vague or recent claim. It was rooted deep in their oral history, passed down specifically as part of who they understood themselves to be. But oral history, no matter how consistently maintained, no matter how central to a community's identity, has often been dismissed by outside academics and institutions as legend rather than verified fact. For generations, Picura's elders spoke about their connection to Chaco, and for generations, that connection existed mostly outside the boundaries of what mainstream science was willing to formally recognize. That started to change because of pressure from the modern world. In recent years, Chaco Canyon, despite being a protected UNESCO World Heritage Site, has faced increasing threats from oil and gas drilling in the surrounding landscape. For the Picuris, and for other tribes with ties to the region, this wasn't just an abstract environmental concern. It was a threat to ancestral land, sacred land, land tied directly to their identity and their history. And in a political and legal world that often demands hard evidence before it grants protection or standing, cultural claims rooted purely in oral tradition can be vulnerable to being ignored. So in 2020, Picuris Pueblo leadership made a bold and frankly unusual decision. Rather than waiting for outside researchers to study their history for them, or continuing to rely solely on oral tradition in a world that too often demanded something else, they reached out directly to a team of international geneticists. They wanted to know, definitively, scientifically, whether their community's DNA actually connected to the ancient people of Chaco Canyon. This was a striking move. Indigenous communities across the Americas have deeply complicated, often painful histories with genetic research. For decades, scientists extracted DNA from indigenous remains and, in some cases, living community members, without proper consent, without partnership, and without returning any benefit or even basic respect to the communities involved. Given that history, choosing to invite genetic researchers in, on their own terms, was a significant act of agency by Picuris leadership. They weren't asking to be studied. They were commissioning an investigation into their own history, on their own terms, to serve their own goals. The research team that took on the project worked with extraordinary care. At specialized ancient DNA facilities, the kind of clean labs specifically designed to prevent contamination from modern human DNA, scientists extracted genetic material from 16 ancient individuals, all of them buried at Picuris Pueblo sometime between 1300 and 1500. These weren't Chaco-era remains. These were later Picuris ancestors, people who lived in the centuries after Chaco's great houses had already emptied out. Alongside these ancient samples, 13 present-day members of the Picuris community voluntarily donated saliva samples, contributing their own living DNA to the study. This gave researchers something powerful, a genetic bridge stretching from the deep past through the centuries in between, all the way to the present day. Once the genomes were sequenced, the real analytical work began. Researchers needed a way to determine whether the Picuris samples, ancient and modern, showed a meaningful genetic relationship to the earlier population at Chaco Canyon, specifically referencing the 9 individuals from Room 33 whose genomes had already been sequenced back in the 2017 study. But they didn't stop at just comparing Picuris to Chaco. To make sure any connection they found was actually meaningful, and not just a coincidence of broader Native American ancestry patterns, they compared the Picuris genetic data against an enormous reference set, roughly 300 different populations from across the Americas, and more than 5,500 individuals from around the entire world. This was about ruling out false positives. If Picuris DNA turned out to be equally similar to dozens of unrelated populations across 2 continents, that would suggest a general, shared ancestral background, rather than any specific, meaningful tie to Chaco Canyon in particular. The results were unambiguous. Out of every single population sampled, past or present, none showed a closer genetic relationship to the ancient people of Chaco Canyon than the Picuris Pueblo. Both the historic burials from 1300 to 1500 and the living community members who donated their DNA in the present day. Researchers went further, identifying specific rare genetic markers shared between the Picuris and the ancient Chaco individuals. Markers unlikely to appear so precisely aligned unless there was a direct ancestral connection between the 2 groups. In plain terms, the oral history that Picuris elders had preserved for centuries, insisting their bloodline trace back to Chaco Canyon, was confirmed by hard genetic science. Not a probable connection, not a loose regional similarity. The strongest, most specific genetic link found anywhere. And then came something that made the story even more extraordinary. As researchers dug deeper into the ancestry represented in the Picuris genomes, they found a connection reaching back far beyond Chaco Canyon itself. The modern Picuris DNA showed a link to Anzac I, a young child whose remains were discovered in Montana and who lived roughly 13,000 years ago as part of the Clovis culture, one of the earliest well-documented populations in the ancient Americas. Some of the ancestral threads found in Picuria's DNA appear to stretch back even further than the height of the Clovis period itself. In other words, the roots of this community, roots that outsiders had spent generations questioning, doubting, or outright dismissing, reached back not just 800 years to Chaco Canyon, but potentially thousands of years earlier, into some of the very earliest chapters of human presence in North America. Take a moment to actually sit with that. A community that colonial history tried to erase, that disease and violence tried to wipe out, that had every reason to lose its own story across the centuries, held onto an oral tradition specific and accurate enough that it was verified in the 21st century using cutting-edge genetic science against a database of thousands of individuals from around the entire world. That is a staggering testament to the strength and accuracy of indigenous oral history, a form of knowledge that has too often been treated by outsiders as unreliable simply because it wasn't written down. So what actually happened to the people of Chaco Canyon? With this new genetic evidence in hand, researchers now believe they have a clearer picture. The data doesn't support some dramatic collapse, a war, a plague, or a sudden catastrophic end. Instead, it points to something quieter and in some ways more human. Or sometime around the year 1200, groups like the ancestors of the Picuries appear to have made a deliberate choice to leave Chaco Canyon behind. One archaeologist involved in analyzing the findings suggested a compelling explanation. Life inside Chaco's tightly structured hierarchical society, the kind of society where a single matrilineal family could hold elevated status for over 300 years, may have become too rigid, too confining for a growing number of people. Leaving wasn't necessarily a retreat from disaster. It may have been an active decision to build something new, smaller, more self-directed communities where families could establish their own social networks, rather than remaining locked into a strict hierarchy centered on Chaco's elite. This wasn't necessarily one single mass exodus happening overnight, but more likely a gradual unwinding families and lineages peeling away over the span of a few generations, until the great houses simply had no one left to maintain them. The genetic data supports this in an interesting way. Rather than showing a population that scattered into tiny, disconnected fragments after leaving Chaco, the evidence suggests that groups like the ancestors of Picuries maintained a population of roughly 3,000 people, even after their departure. That's a substantial, cohesive community, large enough and stable enough to preserve its identity, its language, its oral traditions, its ceremonies, and crucially, its lineage, across the following centuries, generation after generation, without ever fully breaking apart. This is likely a major reason the Picuries were able to maintain such a clear, traceable, unbroken genetic through line all the way to individuals living today. They didn't just survive as scattered individuals, they survived as a community, carrying their history forward together. Of course, no discovery of this magnitude, especially one involving indigenous remains and indigenous DNA, comes without serious ethical questions attached. And this story has plenty of them. The original 9 individuals from room 33, the ones whose 2017 genetic analysis first revealed the matrilineal dynasty, were excavated back in 1896 and sent to New York without any consultation with descendant communities. In the year 2000, the American Museum of Natural History classified those remains as culturally unidentifiable, a legal and institutional label meaning they couldn't be definitively linked to any specific living tribe. On paper, that classification placed the remains in a kind of legal gray area, one that, controversially, allowed researchers to study and even genetically sequence them without needing tribal consent. Many indigenous advocates and scholars have pointed to this exact situation as a clear example of what's sometimes called biocolonialism in scientific research, meaning the practice of extracting value, whether physical remains, DNA, or cultural knowledge, from indigenous communities and their ancestors, without permission and without the community benefiting from, or even being informed about, the resulting research. One of the researchers involved in the later Picuries study was refreshingly candid about this tension. He admitted that the team felt genuinely uneasy about using that older, controversial Chaco Canyon dataset in their new research, precisely because of how it had originally been obtained. But when they raised this concern directly with the Picuries Tribal Council, the response they received was direct and clarifying. The decision about whether that data should be used, they were told, simply wasn't the researchers' call to make. It belonged to the tribe. This distinction matters enormously. It reflects a broader and increasingly urgent conversation happening across the field of ancient DNA research, sometimes described by scholars as an entire ethical crisis within the discipline of paleogenomics. As sequencing technology has advanced rapidly, allowing scientists to extract meaningful genetic information from remains that are centuries or even millennia old, the ethical frameworks meant to guide how that information is gathered, used, and shared have consistently lagged behind. In response to controversies exactly like this one, researchers and indigenous scholars have increasingly pushed for entirely new frameworks to guide this kind of work. Some point specifically to the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as a foundation, arguing that ancient DNA research needs to recognize not just individual consent, the traditional standard used in most biomedical research ethics, but collective rights belonging to entire communities and nations. Alongside this, something called the CARE Principles for Indigenous Data Governance has gained traction as a practical guide. Principles built specifically around the ideas of collective benefit, authority to control, responsibility, and ethics. The core argument is straightforward. When research involves the ancestors, the heritage, or even just the genetic data of a specific living community, that community shouldn't merely be informed after the fact. They should hold real authority over whether the research happens at all, how it's conducted, and what happens to the results and the data afterward. To their credit, the researchers behind the 2025 Picuri study seem to take this lesson seriously, at least by comparison to earlier eras of ancient DNA research in this exact region. This entire project only happened because Picuri's leadership initiated it themselves, on their own terms, specifically to support and validate their own community's history and their own contemporary land claims. The tribe wasn't a passive subject being studied by outsiders. They were the ones asking the question, guiding how the research would be used, and ultimately deciding what role that older, ethically fraught Chaco Canyon data would play in their own story. That's a meaningfully different relationship between science and community than what happened back in 1896, or even back in the mid-2010s. Even so, the researchers involved have acknowledged there's still real work ahead. One scientist on the team openly admitted that tribal leaders across the wider Chaco region weren't formally consulted before that original 2017 Room 33 study was carried out or published, and said he's now actively working to engage with multiple indigenous groups across the Southwest to properly present and discuss what the research actually found. There's also a broader question hanging over all of this. Other burials remain at Pueblo Bonito and at other Chacoan sites, still unstudied, still holding potential answers. Whether and how that research moves forward may increasingly depend on securing genuine buy-in and authority from the descendant communities themselves, rather than treating tribal input as an afterthought. There's a really striking parallel here too, one worth sitting with for a moment. Researchers have pointed to the case of Kennewick Man, ancient remains discovered in Washington state, remains that became the subject of a long and bitter legal battle over who had the right to claim, study, and eventually rebury them. For years, several tribes in the region argued they were ancestrally connected to those remains, an argument that was, for a long time, dismissed or contested by parts of the scientific and legal establishment. Eventually, genetic testing was conducted, and it confirmed a close genetic affiliation between Kennewick Man and at least one of the tribes that had been making that exact claim all along. In that case, just like with the Picuris and Chaco Canyon, actual scientific evidence ended up backing up what indigenous communities had been saying based on their own oral traditions the entire time. And in both cases, that confirmation came only after years, sometimes decades, of the underlying claim being treated with skepticism by outside institutions that demanded proof before they were willing to extend basic recognition or protection. It's worth asking why that burden of proof so often falls exclusively on the community doing the remembering, rather than on the institutions doing the doubting. It's a pattern worth noticing. Genetic science, when it's done carefully, with actual respect and partnership, keeps confirming something indigenous communities across North America have insisted for generations. Their histories were never legend. They were memory, carried carefully across centuries, waiting for the rest of the world to develop the tools necessary to listen. So, bring it all the way back to where this story began. 9 bodies, sealed in a single room beneath Pueblo Bonito, undisturbed for nearly 1,000 years before archaeologists first found them. For over a century, they sat in storage, reduced to museum specimens, their true significance locked away in fragments of degraded DNA that science simply didn't yet have the tools to read. Then, piece by piece, discovery by discovery, that silence started to break. First came the revelation of an unbroken matrilineal dynasty, women passing power and status down through more than 3 centuries at the height of Chacoan civilization. Then came the courage and initiative of the Picuris Pueblo, who refused to let their own history remain a matter of dispute, and who took the extraordinary step of inviting modern science to test what their elders had always known. And when that test came back, it didn't just confirm a connection to Chaco Canyon. It reached back even further, connecting a living, present-day community to some of the very earliest people who ever set foot in the Americas. What started as 9 unidentified skeletons in a forgotten New York City storage room ended up validating an oral tradition that had survived disease, violence, colonization, and centuries of dismissal, proving in the process that some stories don't need to be written down to be true. They just need someone, eventually, willing to listen. And perhaps that's the real lesson buried underneath all the sequencing data, all the sample sizes, and all the technical detail of this story. Science, at its best, isn't a tool used to grant permission to communities to believe their own history. It's simply a tool that occasionally catches up, decades or centuries late, to what those communities were telling everyone the entire time.